Owen Dennis's Infinity Train aired its first book, The Perennial Child, in late 2019. In this video, I'll go through each episode, give it a score, and then talk about the season more in general at the end. Also, just in case you were worried, this video will only contain spoilers for this book, not book 2 or 3. Without any further ado, every episode of Infinity Train, Book 1, reviewed. Episode 1, The Grid Car. Tulip, a headstrong 13-year-old girl, finds a mysterious train where every car contains its own universe. The show opens up with Tulip and her friend Michaela talking about Tulip going to game camp. This opening conversation between friends does a great job in setting up who Tulip is. First, by establishing her love for video games, and then that her parents were recently divorced. And while Michaela does just kind of bring up the fact that Tulip's parents are divorced kind of out of the blue, I do appreciate that the show doesn't try to call it separation or something. It also immediately sets up the theme for the season, but I'll get to that more towards the end of the video. Even Tulip's love for onions shows that she's different than most kids her age. Once Tulip's mother breaks the news that neither her or Tulip's father can take her to game camp, we see Tulip break down. The best part about this scene is the show's ability to portray a conflict without taking a side. While yes, Tulip's dad was the one who scheduled a work trip when he was supposed to take Tulip to game camp, it's hard not to feel for the parents who were trying to make it up to her. Once on the train, we meet One-One. One-One is used as a comic relief during this episode, as well as pretty much the rest of the series. While One-One is less of a character than Tulip, he still adds greatly to this episode. Showing what seems to be a person getting disintegrated and a giant face-sucking cockroach adds some real danger to the show and adds to the mystery. Even though some things are rushed, it's hard to imagine a much better episode. Being able to tell this large of a story in 11 minutes is still pretty incredible. Episode 2, The Beach Car. Tulip strikes a deal with a cat in an attempt to get home, but is the price worth it? Before actually getting to the namesake of the episode, the beach car, the episode starts by showcasing the creativity the show has when it comes to designing cars. There is a crossword car, a pinball car, and even a tiny wizard car. Watching Tulip run through these cars is nice to see. This episode also marks the first appearance of the cat, one of the few characters to appear in more than one episode. The cat is definitely portrayed as a typical con artist, but doesn't fall into many of the stereotypes of one. This episode doesn't really explore the cat's character in interesting ways, but that is mostly remedied in future episodes. Randall's also in this episode, and while he's not very important plot-wise, besides taking Tulip to the cat at the end, he is hilarious. From falling for the cat's pyramid team to creating more Randalls to trick them into the pyramid team, he's definitely a great comic relief for the episode. One thing I love about this episode is the scene where Tulip is working on the shuttlecraft and the main characters are just talking. One problem that many animated shows face now that since the standard, at least for Cartoon Network, is 11-minute long episodes is in order to tell a good long story, they have to have something happening at all times. However, the ability of this episode to slow things down when Tulip's talking about the origins of her name with the other characters is great. The episode does falter a bit in predictability. Tulip regretting trading One-One and getting him back was relatively easy to see coming. I'm not saying they should have gotten rid of One-One or anything, but the relatively simple plot isn't very engaging. Seeing Tulip's number change from scene to scene is cool, even cooler when you rewatch the series and know what the number means. Overall, a pretty great episode, since it fleshes out One-One and Tulip's relationship before Atticus comes in the next episode. Episode 3, The Corgi Car. Tulip and One-One explore a car full of Corgis and face off against a mysterious monster. In this episode, they use the train cars prior to the Corgi car to reference other media, such as Monster Mash and Indiana Jones. While being a bit too on the nose, especially for the former, they are quick and don't obstruct from the main point of the opening scene, Tulip's rush through the train. Tulip's mentality for trying to get through the train as quickly as possible as the main theme for this episode, and I think is executed perfectly. Tulip, at this point, has been on the train for a week with the same number, so it makes sense that she's irritated, especially considering she's only 13. Enough about Tulip, let's get to Corginia. First, the dog jokes in this episode are hilarious. From the door gag to not wanting to be carried, this episode is filled with jokes about canines. The funniest joke has to be this one, though.
Just a little spider, building her little spider web.
Atticus is a great character. While there is both the occasional joke about him being a corgi and him being a king, neither are frequent enough to take over his character. The way he interacts with both One-One and Tulip make him a great fit to fulfill the gang's need for a third member. The actual story for this episode, however, isn't that great. The steward encounter makes painfully little sense even after finishing the series. Tulip not realizing the monster was more than a shadow was a bit hard to sit through. but the jokes from this episode more than make up for the questionable conclusion to the story. The episode continues the show's excellence and makes for another great chapter in the story. Episode 4, The Crystal Car. Tulip, Atticus, and 1-1 enter a crystal forest car and have to take part in a musical ritual. For a show that's only 11 minutes per episode, most episodes in this season are jam-packed with story. This episode, however, just isn't. After getting out of the more interesting car, the straight-up Italy car, we go into the crystal car. Then we have to watch the gang try to understand a mute rock character for a while, which takes painfully long. A montage to show that time has passed would have gotten to the point way faster. Even Tulip trying a bunch of different songs takes forever. Once she finally finds a song that works, the episode's pretty much over. Now, the way I describe this episode, you must think I hate it, right? The thing is, as much as I dislike parts of it, it's still a well-polished, funny episode. Some of the jokes in this episode are just so funny. Like this one.
He can't speak! Just like Atticus. Huh?
I liked the songs from Atticus and 1-1. The ballad of Mustard and Stinktail was funny too. Tulip going from parody to parody song was entertaining, if not a bit long. Even though Tulip is intentionally not a great singer, the song at the end and her dancing with 1-1 and Atticus was very nice. In most shows, I would say this is a great kind of filler episode, but the first 3 episodes were just so action-packed that this one just kind of bores. Also, the topic of looking back on Tulip's family life is handled much better in the next episode. While definitely not a terrible episode by any stretch of the imagination, it just doesn't hold up to the standards of some of the greater episodes in the season. Episode 5, The Cat's Car. Tulip has to face her past. Episodes like this are what set Infinity Train apart from most cartoons of today. Yes, Infinity Train is funny, and yes, Infinity Train has a few great action sequences, but very few shows are able to pull off episodes this creative and this emotionally impactful. Even the scenes before getting into the tapes are great, from the first part subtly setting up the theme of not remembering things as they were, to just how interesting the actual car is, to Atticus disliking the cat from the start because he's a dog. But the real episode starts once you get into the tape. The beginning of the tape is nice and heartwarming, but as soon as things start to get distorted, it starts to become incredibly interesting. From the incredible imagery to the general sadness of it all, it's honestly incredible they got to get this start on Cartoon Network. Not even talking about the incredibly realistic depiction of divorce, how did they even get away with this scene?
What do you mean she won't wake up? Oh, so that's why they closed Off-World.
They somehow got away with featuring a SeaWorld parody where the dolphins literally die. The ending has 2 main parts. The first part is Tulip storming off at the end, completely disregarding the cat and her number. This scene is so powerful. Tulip is completely done with the train at this point and just wants to go home, but once the conductor comes and threatens to murder the cat, the tone shifts from just kind of depressing to complete horror. The cat in this episode goes from seeming completely in charge of what's happening to just a scared little kid at the end. The steward destroying all the cat's things ends this episode on a complete downer. This episode is completely fantastic in almost every regard. While certainly not the funniest episode, this episode is nearly perfect from start to finish and perfectly sets up the second half of the book. Episode 6, The Unfinished Car. The gang enters the unfinished train car and tries to fix it. This episode is just so... So much of it is just so disappointing. Atticus and the King Turtle guy with the name that I don't even want to try to pronounce are the comic reliefs for this episode, and while some of their jokes are funny, like Atticus saying he never trusted stairs, they pretty much boil Atticus right down to a king stereotype. Don't worry though, for the first and pretty much only time in the book, they decide that 1-1 actually gets to be a character. Although now, instead of telling jokes, 1-1 says the same thing over and over and over again until it's painfully clear that 1-1 feels at fault for the wackiness of the car. And before you get a chance to connect 1-1 feeling at fault for the car and Tulip feeling at fault for her parents' divorce, Tulip just tells you in increasingly less subtle ways that that's the lesson you should be taking from this episode. For a show so subtle and smart to not just flat out tell you the theme, but beat it into your head over and over and over again is so infuriating. Also, remember the last episode that ended with Tulip storming out angry? Well, guess what? She starts this episode completely happy again, so I guess she got over that. This episode is boring, painfully unsubtle, and one of the least funny episodes in the series, and a complete tone shift from the last episode. I hate to give an episode of a show I love this low of a score, but I really can't avoid it. Episode 11, The Chrome Car. The gang meets a familiar face in a mirrored car. Disregarding Book 2, this episode seems quite disconnected from the rest of the season. While the chrome car's design itself is pretty neat, the shapes and walls add a bit of graphical flair to the episode's exposition and chase scenes, the episode has nothing to do with the conductor, the engine, the cat, or anything in the last 3 episodes. But as a standalone episode of the series, it's pretty dang good. The villains are creepy and great, their defeat mainly at the hands of a small robot and Corgi with a crown on is a bit of a letdown, but the rest of their moments is pretty great. Engineer Tulip is also a pretty good character, at least by the end. Her being a reflection of Tulip, she is fairly different, although they're not different enough to be complete opposites if that's what they're going for. Side note, what is the canon explanation for the mirror people? So Mirror Tulip is a sliver, but can only be seen in the chrome room, right? But then how come Mirror Atticus and 1-1 are working reflections? Do the mirror police reflect somebody? We see later that Tulip lost her reflection, but can only she see that? This episode has so many questions that I hope get answered in Book 2. Back to the actual episode, the ending's nice. I'm glad they didn't have Mirror Tulip tag along for the last 3 episodes. It would have been a massive turn for her arc. Anyway, this episode is pretty good, both joke-wise and individual episode-wise. I just would have wanted an episode this late into the book to have more of an immediate plot importance. Episode 8, The Ball Pit Car. The gang is confronted by a strange new force on the Ball Pit Car adventure. Well, I guess I'll start with the first half of the episode. Now, 6 minutes of trying to intentionally lull you into a false sense of security seems like it would be excruciatingly boring, but in reality, this segment's just really charming and cute. A lot of the jokes landed, and I liked how Khaki Bottoms didn't end up being the villain it felt like he was destined to become. Seeing the gang chill for one last time before saying their goodbyes is nice to see. But then it all goes downhill fast. If you were attentive enough to the backgrounds during this episode, you already saw this coming, but the steward and conductor show up to just wreak havoc. Tulip being just barely caught by the steward is chilling. Atticus seeming like he's about to defeat the steward before he just doesn't is heart-wrenching. I honestly have no idea how Owen Dennis got the end of this episode past Cartoon Network censors, considering it literally features a 13-year-old girl being forced to watch her friends be gunned down while she is continuously told that's her fault. But man, I love this scene so much. Tulip holding back tears, Atticus's leitmotif being played when the monster temporarily spares Tulip, the ending with Tulip crying next to her mutated friend is all so perfect. It cannot be understated how great the ending of this episode is. It's incredibly moving to see Tulip, generally portrayed as tough, break down with the potential loss of a friend. It's fairly obvious what the ranking I'm giving this episode is, considering I can't find anything negative to say about it. Episode 9, The Past Car. Tulip takes a risk trusting an old foe. We start this episode right where the last one left off, Tulip moping around near Atticus's new form. Tulip's reluctance to even consider accepting the cat's offer at first was nice to see. I'm glad that she actually remembered the cat's history of trickery. While the second episode within someone's tape sounds like it would be a retread, this episode is still quite interesting. The problem I have with this episode is, unlike episode 5, an episode I consider near perfect, this one falters in a few key ways. First, 1-1's there. Now, I don't hate 1-1 as a character, but he's obviously meant mostly in the show as a comedic relief. Planting him in this episode for no reason other than to further imply his importance ruins some otherwise great scenes. Like, for example, in this scene where we learn that Amelia, actually Aldrich, died, and Tulip asks where she is, 1-1 goes,
Where's Amelia?
Gone forever?
Like, although that isn't a joke, it just completely ruins any sense of sadness from this scene. Also, while Amelia's tape is great, the characters just talking through it constantly make it so hard to enjoy. But once you get past that, the tape is a beautifully told tale of 2 lovers which ends in complete tragedy. But after that, let's talk about the ending. I do enjoy Tulip calling the cat out on not just telling her how to save Atticus, but I guess it doesn't really matter when the writers who wrote this call out are the same ones who wrote it. Tulip's monologue explaining how her and Amelia are very similar is surprisingly good. Generally, characters telling you the theme is a bit, well, awful, but this really doesn't feel that way. Tulip delivers these lines in a semi-realistic way, but the scene after that is nearly inexcusably bad. Tulip, whose prior coding experience is building a less complicated, barely working Space Invaders clone, is able to take control of a moving train car system that's completely foreign to her. But besides that lackluster and confusing ending, the episode is just generally pretty good. The tape itself is fantastic, but the characters talking throughout all of it is painful. I likely would have been kinder to this episode, but due to it being the penultimate one, I'm gonna have to give it a relatively average score. Episode 10, The Engine. Tulip makes it to the front of the train and is faced with a choice. Here we are, arguably the most important episode of the show, and I'm excited to say that it nailed it. The cat's adieu was a bit underwhelming, but I'm glad that she at least got a little bit of screen time. Then came the Amelia-Tulip fight, which is without a doubt the best action of the season. I'm glad they didn't make Tulip suddenly a master fighter, but the fight was still pretty good. The mystery of the conductor ending up being 1-1 was a bit predictable, especially due to episodes like the unfinished car, but it's still a great reveal. And oh man, the scene where Atticus jumps out of the monster and his little leitmotif plays is so great. I can just rewatch it over and over and over again, and it's hype every single time. Tulip's goodbyes to the gang are nice too, especially Atticus's line about a heavy heart, which is a great double entendre.
My heart is heavy. I am honored to carry the weight, for it will remind me of you.
And while yes, I would have liked to see a 7 months later for Atticus, Tulip's is fine too. While seeing her parents ask where she was and why she doesn't have a reflection would have been nice, I understand they didn't really have time for that. It's a bit hard to believe after 5 months of, I guess, presuming their daughter is dead, they'd be back to normal in 7 months, but perhaps some of the questions will be answered later in the series. Still a great finale, which answers enough questions to be satisfying, but leaves enough unanswered for Season 2. Well, that's the end of the episode, so now is the time for a more general talk of the season. I'll try to keep this relatively brief, but I do have some things I want to talk about that don't fit so nicely into individual episodes. First, the music is insanely good. Not only is it good, but some of the repeating sound effects for the characters fit them so well. For example, every time Atticus does something or something related to Atticus is shown, you hear Atticus! But with the smaller stuff out of the way, let's talk about the theme and story arc. The theme of not running away from your problems and realizing things aren't always your fault are both portrayed fairly well. I wish the themes were a bit more subtle and not told to us directly by Tulip, but they're both fairly decent. The story arc is fairly consistent through the episodes, with all but a few being pretty plot-centric, and it's really good. The mystery of both the number and conductor are great, if not a little bit predictable, and seeing Tulip go through so many different interesting trains and meet so many different interesting characters is very cool. The mystery aspect in general is great, but the villain is dynamic and the characters all play a role. Speaking of characters, they are all mostly pretty good and contribute to the great comedy of the show, even at times when it's less warranted. Tulip especially is great. I was really sad to see her go. Her journey from beginning to end is great, and her character development is phenomenal. The cat is also very interesting, if not a little bit too mysterious. I hope she comes back for book 2 or 3. Amelia probably could have been fleshed out a bit more, but I understand that was hard to do, considering the book itself is under 2 hours. Atticus and 1-1 are both funny, and especially Atticus had some great moments and jokes. The character chemistry is pretty much mastered by episode 4, and is continued all the way to the end. Overall, Infinity Train Book 1 is a fantastic story with great characters and a phenomenal mystery that makes it easy to recommend to anybody who's even interested in any of those genres. Averaging all the review scores for each episode gives you an 8 out of 10, which I agree with. It wasn't perfect, but it was a great first season of a show. I won't go over them much here since I already talked about them, but my least favorite episode was the unfinished car, and my favorite was the cat's car. Close second to the ball pit car, however. That's all I have to say. This has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in the next